Hi everybody, Armoured Pants here, and I have another video for you. This is the Luchs Light Tank Complete Guide, and we have the Luchs tank, of course, in the current Battle Pass. So I thought it would be good to take a look at this, as many of you will be playing it, and many of you asked for this video. Now, as always, we're going to have a look at the tech spec for this tank. We're going to have a look at that using blitzhanger.com. And this actually, by the way, is a real tank. It existed in World War II. There were 103 of these produced between 1943 and 1944, based on the Panzer II, which is why it looks so similar. But they gave it better tracks, the similar track system that was on the Panther and the Tiger, and they gave it better different gun system, etc., to make it a more effective scouting vehicle. So let's have a look at the tech details as they appear now in Blitz. In terms of provisions, by the way, I would run chocolate bar because there's only 2 provisions available anyway, and that'll max out performance. I'd run calibrated shell supercharger and vertical stabilizer because it has a magazine gun system. It has a 30mm gun, which is the pew 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 little gun system, but it is actually quite effective. Reload is 7.6 seconds for the magazine, and that is actually 2 times 2 shells within the magazine. Pen is 84mm and 116mm if you use calibrated shells, which I think you should do. There's only 2 round types, AP and APC or. And if possible, use a 2-step burst because there's a dispersion multiplier, which we'll discuss in a second. So you need to manage that if possible. Damage is 45 and 35 damage points per shell. Burst damage is 180 and 140. Depending on whether you fire AP or APCR. Now, muzzle velocity is 1,222 meters per second, or 1248 meters per second if you use APCR. So not much difference between standard and Pramo rounds. Now, the gun index is 7.1, which is really good, right? But that's on the first burst. Because of dispersion multiplier, it drops to 1.8 on the second burst. That's why, if possible, and it's not always possible, but if possible, fire the first 2 shells in the magazine, let the dispersion then drop down, and then fire the second 2. So 2-step burst if possible. Mobility index is 8.6, which is like tier 7, tier 8 mobility. But one thing, be aware of the traverse. The tank traverse on this is dreadful. It feels like you've just driven into a jar of treacle when you're trying to turn this tank. And it's completely unexpected because of the tank's speed, so please be aware of that. Concealment at its own view range of 267 is 195 if you're not moving, 246 if you fire, and it's smaller maps, so therefore you will encounter at tier 4, so therefore it is good skill. Obviously, as I said, if you're not moving, but even if you are moving, if you're not firing, it's still 195 because you have that light tank camo numbers, which don't get affected whether you're moving or still, only affected when you fire. And we looked at the armor there, doesn't really have any, right? So that's what you expect with a light tank, right? Virtually no armor. So, you need to bear that in mind. You get a bit of protection on the turret though because of that gun mantlet. It has 8 degrees of gun depression and 20 degrees of elevation, so therefore it has decent gun alignment. So that's something to bear in mind as well. And it does 60 kilometers an hour, right? So that's phenomenal, right? And that's where this mobility index comes from. But again, please be aware of its traverse speed. That is the ability of the tank to turn. So not the turret traverse, but the tank itself. It is truly horrendous. And by the way, nothing like this Luchs was in the game before 5.5. This tank used to be a terror at tier 4. It was basically a small leopard before the leopard, of course, got nerfed as well. So this tank was really effective. But of course, Luchs means lynx in English, and they definitely pulled the teeth of this tank after 5.5. I mentioned to you, by the way, guys, this was a real tank. It's also one of the rarest tanks from World War II for 2 reasons. Firstly, there's only 131 of them made, but secondly, there's only 2 now in existence. One in Bovington and another one in the Tank Museum in France. So let's have a look at the gameplay. I'm going to have a look at a mastery game using the little Luchs, the Lynx, and it is a wily little cat. As I said, it is not a fraction of the tank it used to be, but nonetheless, it still can be very effective. I'm running 2 repair kits and engine accelerator, which I would recommend you use too. And you can see here, look, starts off, it's like shit off a shovel, right? It's really fast. Getting up to its top speed is not a problem. Its traverse, its turning ability is the problem. And this is a real problem, and as I said, it's unexpected. Because when you consider light tanks, you think of them as being really agile, mobile, and really able to get around the map, and this can do that. But you also think of them as being, turning really well, and this tank does not do that, not at all. So you need to be aware of that. This is particularly a problem if you're trying to, for example, get into a circle of death type situation. This tank it's going to be very, very difficult to do. You're going to struggle, right? So please be aware of that. Maybe even take it out onto a training room if you've never played it before, just so you can get used to that poor ability to turn traverse. Now, I'm not talking about turn traverse. As I said, this is about the tank's ability to turn. You saw there the 8 degrees of gun depression is allowing me to get some shots into the M7. Another thing I would say about this tank, by the way, is that it has a decent credit coefficient because it's a collectible tank, but it is only 92%. But it's better than most tier 4 tanks, and better than Tech 3 tanks, of course. But one thing you need to be aware of is that you will burn up some of those credits because you've only got a 30mm gun. You will have to use APCR sometimes. So, for example, when firing onto a WWII, a Matilda, or the M7, as you saw there, very heavily armored tanks, you will probably need to use APCR, especially if you're front onto them. Otherwise, AP is fine, and if you're side on or you're facing the back of an enemy tank, then it's no problem whatsoever. I could have easily penned him there on the side with AP. I forgot to switch back, but you'll see here in front of the Matilda, you need to use APCR. You will not pen it. That also goes for the B1 and the PZB2 if you're fighting those. And of course, if you're up tiered, and I was up tiered in several games in this tank when I was shooting the video, if you come up against a KV1 or a T1 heavy or something like that, you're going to need APCR. Don't be under any illusions that you're going to be able to pen them, especially front on, if you don't use APCR. So you're going to use APCR, so make sure you have APCR loaded up, and make sure that you then utilize that APCR, because you're going to need it if you want to get your actual DPM numbers up. I mentioned to you about the dispersion multiplier. So how does that work? Well, dispersion basically is taken as from a 0 point, right? But if you fire, and it's normally not a problem when you have a single shot gun system, right? You fire, and by the time you've reset, dispersion is back down to its 0 setting, right? But when you have a gun system, like here, where you have a magazine, if you fire immediately after the shells have been fired, then your dispersion is not at 0. Your dispersion is at its maximum, and therefore you have therefore you're adding on the new dispersion, not to 0 but to your maximized dispersion. So therefore you have this dispersion multiplier effect, and that's why, if possible, it's better to fire this gun system in 2 bursts. Now I understand that's not always possible, but also bear in mind that dispersion is effective at 100 meters, right? So that's the figure. If you are close up, then obviously the dispersion effect is much less. So if you're close up to a target, you don't need to worry so much about the dispersion. If you're firing over a distance, particularly 100 meters and above, you really do. So therefore, firing in 2 bursts to empty the magazine is more effective and would help your actual DPM numbers. So I think overall this is a good example of this tank in action. It's a great little light tank. It's great for practicing light tanks skills if you haven't played in a light tank before. You see there a mastery game from the Panzer Kampfwagen to Luchs, or Lynx as it is known. So let's have a recap of the key points about this little tank. Personally, by the way, I'm glad to see it coming back into the game. I used to play it quite a bit when I was learning how to play light tanks, but it was a very, very different cat than before it had its claws pulled. but still it is an excellent light tank. And as I said, as a collectible tank, it has better credit coefficient than most tanks in its tier, and it's at 92%. Its speed for its tier is insane, right? It's like got 60 kilometers per hour, which is just great. So therefore it's a great training tank for learning how to drive a very fast tank if you haven't played light tanks before. It's gun alignment is great with that 8 and 20 degrees of depression and elevation, and it has some turret armor with that mantlet, so be aware of that. So it can go hold down, particularly if you're up against smaller guns. 30mm gun is small, but strange enough it has decent pen, as you saw there, but APC is required for the reasons that we discussed during the gameplay. Be aware of the dispersion multiplier. Minimize that if possible by firing in the magazine off in 2 bursts if you can. I know it's not always possible. And again, the major thing, caveat emptor, buyer beware, the tank traverse is awful, mainly because they remove provisions from this tank against its original design. So I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found that useful. And now I guess all remains for me to say is cheers, Mush, and as always, pants off.